with the terror. Even the concentrationary universe produced by it doesn't have a straightforward direction or an undifferentiated landscape. Far from being a static system, it continued to rotate like a spinning top, and nevertheless pass through relatively cruel and humane cycles. 462 These are the opinions of an American historian who not only in the starkest terms describes the history that began in October 1917, but who also mocks the Western statesmen who let themselves be fooled by a butcher, albeit very shrewd as Stalin was. They felt a sense of respect for him. 463 Another book by a Russian historian committed to proving the similarity between Stalin's USSR and the Third Reich makes a similar argument. Nevertheless, the two studies, to which I will make reference to in analyzing the concentrationary universe of Soviet Russia, tell a story very different to that intended by their authors. Indeed, the painting drawn by the American historian could here and there be confused with a product of Soviet propaganda, if it had not come from a fiercely anti-communist author. Let's begin to examine it. In 1921, while the Civil War rages on, for some time the Butica prison of Moscow operates as follows, quote, "The prisoners were allowed free run of the prison. They organized morning gymnastic sessions, founded an orchestra and a chorus, created a club supplied with foreign journals and a good library. According to tradition, dating back to pre-revolutionary days, every prisoner left behind his books after he was freed. A prisoner's council assigned everyone cells, some of which were beautifully supplied with carpets on the floors and walls. Another prisoner remembered that we strolled along the corridors as if they were boulevards. To Babina, prison life seemed unreal. Can't they even lock us up seriously?" Unquote. Another socialist revolutionary, arrested in 1924 and sent to Sarajevo, is happily surprised to find herself in a place that didn't resemble a prison at all. Not only can the political prisoners obtain abundant provisions of food and clothing thanks to their contacts, but they could turn their prison cell into the women's branch of the socialist revolutionaries. Some years later, on the Solovetsky Islands, we see that the prisoners, many of them having been scientists in St. Petersburg, not only had access to a theater and a library with 30,000 volumes, but also had a botanical garden, including a museum of flora, fauna, and of local art and history. 464 It's true, the situation in the prison system at that moment in time was not uniform. However, the ones just stated are not isolated cases. However, even if they should be treated as isolated and happy islands, their existence in itself would be significant. Of course, there was no absence of protests, but it's interesting to read the demands made during a hunger strike by political prisoners, quote, "Expand the library, include newspapers published in the USSR, at least with editions of the key, completely update the economics, politics and literature sections, and the sections with the works of minority languages. Allow the subscription to at least one foreign newspaper. Allow the enrollment in courses by correspondence. Organize for such purposes a special cultural fund, as happens even in criminal penitentiaries. Allow the introduction into prison of all foreign publications permitted in the USSR, in particular the permitted foreign newspapers, including the bourgeois ones. Allow the exchange of books between prisoners and guards. Acquire paper in quantities of no less than 10 notebooks per person each month." 465 Unquote. This is in June of 1931, and the date is significant. While it brings with it a massive expansion of the concentrationary universe, Stalin's rise to power and the campaign launched by him for the liquidation of the kulaks as a class didn't dramatically alter the situation existing within that universe. This is not just true for the political prisoners. The beginning of the 30s were almost prosperous and even liberal for prisoners. The management of the Gulag showed a certain level of religious tolerance and accepted the petition for a vegetarian diet put forward by the members of certain religious sects. 466. What follows is an excerpt on the penal colonies in the far north at the start of the 1930s. Quote, needing hospitals, camp administrators built them, and introduced systems for training prisoner pharmacists and prisoner nurses. Needing food, they constructed their own collective farms, their own warehouses, and their own distribution systems. Needing electricity, they built power plants. Needing building materials, they built brick factories. Needing educated workers, they trained the ones that they had. Much of the ex-Kulak workforce turned out to be illiterate or semi-literate, which caused enormous problems when dealing with projects of relative technical sophistication. The camp's administration therefore set up technical training schools, which required, in turn, more new buildings and new cadres, math and physics teachers, as well as political instructors to oversee their work. By the 1940s, Vorkuta, a city built in the permafrost, where roads had to be resurfaced and pipes had to be repaired every year, had acquired a geological institute and a university, theaters, puppet theaters, swimming pools, and nurseries. 467. Unquote, as strange as it may be, the Gulag little by little brought civilization, if it can be called that, to remote uninhabited areas. 468. Among the leaders and administrators, there were those that demonstrated humanity and intelligence. Quote, Berzin seems to have very much approved of Gorky's ideas about prisoner reform. Glowing with paternalistic goodwill, Berzin provided his inmates with film theaters and discussion clubs, libraries and restaurant-style dining halls. He planted gardens, complete with fountains and a small zoological park. He also paid prisoners regular salaries, and operated the same policy of early release for good work as did the commanders of the White Sea Canal. 469. Unquote, on the other hand, because of the famine, the need to increase the prisoners' productivity, the lack of organization and often incompetence, and the rapacity of the local leaders, tragedies abound. 470. Particularly atrocious is the tragedy that in 1933 hits the exiles who were supposed to cultivate the island of Nazino. It's a task that quickly proves desperate, lacking equipment, with medicine and food in large part used up during the journey, on a completely virgin island, without any structures or homes. The deportees sought to survive by eating the dead bodies or carrying out genuine acts of cannibalism. They are details taken from a letter sent by a local communist leader to Stalin and later passed on to all Politburo members, who were noticeably upset by it. The Nazino tragedy had a notable impact and was subject to investigation by a number of commissions. 471. It's evident that it wasn't homicidal intention that caused the horror. We're dealing with a significant example of how things could go badly due to a lack of planning. At least until 1937, in the Gulag people would die by misfortune, as a consequence of poor organization. 472. What characterizes the Soviet concentrationary universe is, firstly, the fixation on development, and that fixation, if on the one hand provokes the infamy of Nazino, on the other hand has very different consequences. As in the society as a whole, they hope to encourage socialist emulation among the prisoners. Those who stand out can enjoy additional food and other privileges. And that's not all. Quote, eventually, top performers were also released early. For every 3 days of work at 100% norm fulfillment, each prisoner received a day off his sentence. When the canal was finally completed, on time, in August 1933, 12,484 prisoners were freed. Numerous others received medals and awards. One prisoner celebrated his early release at a ceremony complete with the traditional Russian presentation of bread and salt, as onlookers shouted, "Hooray for the builders of the canal!" In the heat of the moment, he began kissing an unknown woman. Together, they wound up spending the night on the banks of the canal. 473. Unquote, the pedagogical obsession is interlinked with a productive obsession. as shown by the presence in the camps of an educational cultural department, an institution in which Muscovite leaders of the Gulag truly believed in. Precisely for that reason they took wall newspapers very seriously. Indeed, if we read them, we see that the biographies of the rehabilitated prisoners are written in a language extraordinarily similar to those of good workers outside the colony. They worked, studied, made sacrifices and tried to improve. 474 The aim was to re-educate the prisoners, transforming them into Stakhanovites, among the first in line prepared to participate with patriotic enthusiasm in the development of the country. Let's turn, then, to the American historian on the Gulag. In the camps, as in the world outside, socialist competitions continued to take place, work competitions in which the detainees competed to see who could produce more. Moreover, they celebrated the Stakhanovite workers for their alleged capacity to triple or quadruple their quotas. 475 It's no coincidence that until 1937, the guard addressed the prisoner as comrade. 476 Being confined to the concentration camp didn't exclude the possibility of social promotion. Many prisoners ended up working as guards or camp administrators. 477 Overall, as we've seen, no small number of them learned a profession to exercise following the moment of their release. It's true that 1937 witnesses a brutal turn. While the Third Civil War rages and increasingly ominous clouds gather on the international horizon, the fifth column, real or assumed, becomes the objective of an increasingly obsessive hunt. In such circumstances the detainee is no longer a potential comrade. It's then prohibited to refer to them as such. They are now called citizen, but it's a citizen that is potentially an enemy of the people. Is it from this moment on that the Soviet concentration camp is driven by homicidal intent? 478 That is how the American researcher repeatedly cited here thinks, but yet again her research refutes her. In the 1940s, in theory the KVC of each camp had an instructor, a small library, and a circular where theatrical performances and concerts were organized, as well as political conferences and debates. 479 There's more. While Hitler's war of annihilation rages on and the country finds itself in an absolutely desperate situation, time and money are generously invested to strengthen and improve the propaganda, manifestos, and the political indoctrination meetings for the prisoners. Quote, within the records of the Gulag administration alone, there are hundreds and hundreds of documents testifying to the intensive work of the Cultural Educational Department. In the first quarter of 1943, for example, at the height of the war, frantic telegrams were sent back and forth from the camps to Moscow, as camp commanders desperately tried to procure musical instruments for their prisoners. Meanwhile, the camps held a contest on the theme The Great Motherland War of the Soviet People against the German fascist occupiers. 50 camp painters and 8 sculptors participated. 480 Unquote. In the very same year, the head of a camp with 13,000 detainees offered an important summary of their activity. Quote, he notes grandly that in the second half of that year, 762 political speeches were given, attended by 70,000 prisoners. At the same time, the KVC held 444 political information sessions, attended by 82,400 prisoners. It printed 5,046 wall newspapers, read by 350,000 people. It put on 232 concerts and plays, showed 69 films, and organized 38 theatrical groups. 481 Unquote. Certainly, with the start of Hitler's invasion, the detainees experienced the dramatic consequences of the shortages, but that has nothing to do with the emergence of homicidal intention. Quote, the high mortality rates in the concentration camps in certain years partly reflect the events taking place on the outside. In the winter of 1941 to 1942, when a quarter of the Gulag population dies of hunger, maybe 1 million residents die of hunger in Leningrad, surrounded by the German blockade." Unquote. And the shortages and malnutrition were widely felt across the Soviet Union. 482 Yet even in such a desperate situation, in January of 1943, the Soviet government created a food fund specifically for the Gulag and, at any rate, the supply situation improved when the tide of the war turned in favor of the Soviet Union. 483 We are so far from the emergence of homicidal intention that the atmosphere of national unity brought out by the Great Patriotic War is felt even within the Gulag. In the meantime, it experiences a massive reduction in population as a result of a series of amnesties. We especially see ex-prisoners heroically take part in combat. They express their satisfaction and pride in the fact that they have access to technologically advanced weapons produced thanks to the industrialization of the country, which was marked by the first consistent expansion of the concentration area universe. They have careers in the Red Army, are accepted into the Communist Party, and win honors and medals for their military courage. 484 With the alternation between relatively prosperous and liberal phases and clearly economically and juridically worse phases for the prisoners, the history of the Gulag reflects the history of Soviet society. The efforts to achieve Soviet democracy in the society as a whole, the democratic socialism and even a socialism without the dictatorship of the proletariat correspond with the efforts to re-establish socialist legality or revolutionary legality in the Gulag. It's for that reason that harsh denunciations of the Soviet concentration area universe come from inside and from its top leadership. In 1930, it's Yagoda who seeks to intervene in the entire prison system, which is rotten to the core. In February of 1938, it's Vinchinsky himself, General Prosecutor of the USSR, who denounces the prison conditions insufficient and, in some particular cases, almost completely intolerable, that reduce man to savage animals. Some months later it's Lavrentiy Beria, chief of the secret police under Stalin, who supports a policy that encourages severe punishment to the interrogators who consider beatings to be the principal method of investigation, and who cripple prisoners when they don't have sufficient proof of their anti-Soviet activity. 485 It's not a question of ritual denunciations. When exposed, those guilty of abuses are severely punished, punishment that even includes death sentences. Many are fired. There's even conflict between magistrates and the repressive apparatus, which opposes the introduction of rules that seem to be an extremely undesirable intrusion. 486 With the aim of strengthening oversight, the submission of complaints and petitions by detainees is encouraged. Other times they seek to improve the situation by using amnesty and reducing overcrowding in the camps. 487 In the period between one denunciation and another, a real improvement is noticed. These are the liberal phases, hastened at times by the outbreak of new crises. But in the combination of objective circumstances and subjective responsibility, the Gulag, as well as society as a whole, is unable to overcome the state of emergency.